Hi, I'm Rod Bryant. Welcome to the second installment of Chiddushei Dat. This is going to be part two. We're going to be dealing with some difficult passages and further examining some of the other rabbis that have weighed in on this subject matter. One that obviously is a very well-known name is Harav Hagon Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was, along with Ovadia Yosef, one of the two most important deciphers of the code of Jewish law, Pashkum of the 21st century. Rabbi Moshe was a towering scholar whose influence, authority, and writings impacted the life of all Torah-observant Jews worldwide. He was particularly important to the North American Jewish community. A prominent American posek recently described Rav Moshe Feinstein as the Maimonides of American Jewry. In the middle decades of the 20th century, Rabbi Feinstein penned a number of letters addressing Noahide practices. He devoted many paragraphs to specifically untangling the concept of Chiddushei Dat. A full overview of Rav Moshe's analysis would require far more time and space than we have allotted in these classes. And maybe we should do that at some other date in a different class. Translations of Rav Moshe's letters are being prepared as an appendix of this course and will soon be available to all the students for free. We'll present here a summary of Rav Moshe's writings on the subject. Let's first examine the source of Chiddushei Dat. Very important. Just as Noahides have Chiddushei Dat, Jews have a similar prohibition to Chiddushei Dat called Baal Tosef, which specifically prohibits Jews from creating new mitzvahs or adding to and modifying existing mitzvahs. Non-Jews, however, do not have the prohibition of Baal Tosef. In fact, we only know of the Noahide prohibitions against Torah study and Shabbat observances because of specific Torah verses from which these prohibitions are derived. From where then does Maimonides derive the prohibition of Chiddushei Dat? Rav Moshe explains that there are commonalities in the underlying reasons behind the prohibitions. For example, the Talmud and the Midrash both describe the study of Torah as an impermissible manner, and keeping Shabbat as misappropriation of mitzvah command only to Israel and the Jewish people. By analyzing these commonalities, the other writings of Maimonides, and many other sources, Rav Moshe Feinstein concludes that the Chiddushei Dat is not only the underlying reason for the Noahide prohibitions for Torah study and Shabbat observance, is a general principle governing Noahide practices. This is why Maimonides writes the general rule governing this matter. It is Harav Moshe's explains that, and Shabbat observances and certain types of Torah studies are singled out because there are the most severe transgressions for the Noahides and the only ones involving the death penalty. The reason why the death penalty is prescribed in this situation, not that it is ever recorded that it has happened, but it is to demonstrate the severity, just like other Torah laws. Death penalty, for example, of lighting a fire on Shabbat for a Jew. Now, let's make note, however, that this penalty is at the hands of heaven, not administered by an earthly court. When they say death penalty, it doesn't mean that he's taken out and stoned. This is what Maimonides means when he writes, he is obligated to die for his actions. However, he is not actually executed. Voluntarily keeping the mitzvahs. Let's discuss this because in last class we talked pretty extensively about it. Rav Moshe notes a particular issue in paragraph 10 and the Radbaz's interpretation of paragraph 10. Quoting, should a non-Jew wish to perform, this comes from paragraph 10, one of the Torah other mitzvahs in order to receive merit or benefit, we should not prevent him from doing so, even according to all of its details. Radbaz states, if he wants to perform a mitzvah, saying that he has an obligation in the matter, we'll not allow him to do so. However, if he may perform it in order to receive reward, as one who performs a mitzvah voluntarily. This is why Maimonides is careful to write these words, we stated this last class, in order to receive merit and benefit. Once again, emphasizing a non-Jew who has rejected avodah zarah, who has rejected idolatry, accepts the Torah given to Moshe from God himself, that Torah is germane to the nations as well, because the Jewish people have the responsibility to teach the Torah. Nothing's prohibited him from taking on other mitzvahs as long as he's only doing it for merit or doing it out of his devotion to Hashem and not about obligation, because Hashem has commanded that. As we've mentioned in the previous lesson, the Talmud explicitly states that a non-Jew who performs a Jewish mitzvah for the sake of reward does not actually receive reward for his mitzvah. Now, how are we to explain this contradiction? There is a classical debate in the Talmud as to whether or not a Jew who performs a mitzvah in which he is not obligated is considered either pious or foolish. I explained to someone one day that leaving my previous abode as a Christian pastor to take upon the Sheva Mitzvot and to follow after Hashem, the one true God, was either extremely pious or extremely foolish. I would hope to say it's the first, that it was a pious decision, not a foolish decision. God forbid that following Hashem out of avodah zarah would be foolish. Now the Talmud, Yerushalmi, Shabbos 1, verse 2, states that a Jew who performs a mitzvah in which he is not obligated is a hedyot, a foolish person. However, there are numerous examples in rabbinic literature of people receiving praise for such performance of mitzvahs. Why is the performance of a voluntary mitzvah sometimes called praiseworthy and sometimes called foolish? Well, the answer lies in the nature of non-obligation. Let's examine some points about that. Sometimes a mitzvah exists, but an individual is not obligated to exactly fulfill it. For example, all Jews are commanded in the mitzvah of tefillin. Nevertheless, women are exempt from wearing tefillin. Theoretically, if a woman does don tefillin in the right way and with the right intention, she may receive reward and she may not be called a hedyot. For example, it should be noted, this is theoretical. For many reasons, halakha, women do not wear tefillin. Rav Moshe discusses the relationship of a Jewish child under the age of 12 or 13 to the mitzvot. Below these ages, children are not obligated to the mitzvot. Nevertheless, a Jewish child is still bound to the covenant of the mitzvahs, even though their specific obligations are not yet been enforced. Rav Moshe writes that a child receives reward for their voluntary mitzvahs. In a case when no mitzvah exists for a person, but he performs the mitzvah anyway, such a person is called hedyot, a foolish person. In this situation, the person is called foolish because their action is not holy and holds no spiritual value. That is the general case when people quote this to non-Jews without further explanation is very, very damaging. For example, on Sukkot, there is a mitzvah for Jews to eat and sleep in a sukkah. If it's raining, though, one is exempt from eating and sleeping in a sukkah. The Rama writes that a Jew decides to sit in a sukkah despite the rain is called hedyot, foolish. In the case of rain, the mitzvah of eating and sleeping in the sukkah is not suspended. Rather, it has ceased to exist entirely. In such a case, the sitter is merely sitting outside in the rain rather than being a holy act. Their mitzvah has become a foolish one. Maimonides writes similarity in the Talmud Yerushalmi. It is stated, anyone who performs a mitzvah in which he is not commanded from the Torah is hedyot. This is discussing someone who performs a mitzvah to which he is obviously no connection whatsoever. Then he is in effect adding to the Torah. However, one who does a mitzvah of the Torah according to the proper performance, even though he is not commanded in it, such as a woman receives reward. Maimonides adds to the definition of hedyot, a Jew who performs a mitzvah that in which he is no obligation is called foolish, because he thinks that he is acting piously. However, he may actually be committing a transgression, and that transgression would be adding to the Torah. Now, to fully appreciate the concepts of Baal Tosef and hedyot, we need to understand the idea of bitul Yeshuas, the nullification of ego and will, a very important term, and you can refer to it down in the source notes. Bitul, my will versus God's will. Let's examine that. Who defines for us what actions are holy or not? Can we decide that an act is holy or a mitzvah on our own? Well, of course, no, we cannot. The entire concept of a mitzvah is that God has defined it for us. And he's defined it in such a way that it is meaningful and holy, and what is not meaningful or holy. He determines that. Therefore, our will is to a large degree irrelevant. Our duty as servants of Hashem. God is Betul Jesus, to nullify our will in search for a servitude of his will. We must strive to understand God's will, learn to recognize it, and learn how to fulfill it according to its specific details. The objective guidepost for determining God's will and its fulfillment is the study of Torah according to the principle of Torah, elucidated, handed down from time immemorial. In certain areas, God has given the man free leadway to the beauty of mitzvahs, or to declare certain things holy or set aside for service of God. However, if a Jew decides to do a mitzvah where it clearly does not apply, that Jew is forcing his will upon God. If a Jewish farmer in the Midwest decides not to work his field on the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and insists that he's doing it for God, he's called Hidyot, a foolish person. For one, the mitzvah only exists in the land of Israel. God's desire is only that the Holy Land rest on the sabbatical year, not any other land. To rest another non-holy land in the sabbatical year is to diminish the importance of Israel and the mitzvah of Shemitah. Second, our farmer is endangering his livelihood, which is pretty foolish. Lastly, if he loses his farm or creates tension among his family and business associates because of his religious observance, then it is also considered Chilul Hashem, meaning it discredits the name of God, a discretion of the Torah itself. All of the foregoing applies to Jews. The Jewish people are very stringently enjoined against the idea of forcing their will upon Hashem. Now, if this is the case for the Jew, Rav Moshe wonders why would we or should we assume that it is any different for the Noahites? After all, there are not two Torahs. The fundamental mechanism of Torah applies equally to Jews and to Noahites. It is vitally important for everyone wishing to adopt a Noahide identity to embrace this simple point. There are not two Torahs. The same mechanics that govern the Jewish observance of the 613 mitzvahs also govern the Noahide observance of the Sheva mitzvot. Just as the Jews have Baal Tosef, the Noahide has Chiddushei Dat. The concept of Hidyot applies equally to both Jew and Noahide. Rav Moshe, reading of Maimonides and Radbaz, and I'll read these texts again, a non-Jew, from paragraph 9, a non-Jew who delves into Torah is obligated to die. They should only be involved in the study of their 7 commandments. Similarly, a non-Jew who rests even on the weekday, observing that day, similarly on the Shabbat, is obligated to die. Needless to say, this is also the case if he creates a festival for himself. These two prohibitions are unique because they are the most severe. This is why they are singled out by the Talmud and Maimonides. The general rule of governing these matters is this: they may not originate a new religion or create performance of mitzvahs for themselves based on their own reasoning. That's what that text is about. The prohibition of Chiddushei Dat is not limited to Shabbat and festivals and Torah study, but applies to all mitzvahs of Torah. Chiddushei Dat is a transgression whether a non-Jew creates a new religious practice for himself or behaves as if he is obligated in the other mitzvahs of the Torah. One should either convert or accept all the mitzvahs or uphold their commandments without adding or detracting. That's what the text says. Let's look at the most important point to this discussion. This point is perhaps the most important yet. The prohibition of Chiddushei Dat does not exist to reduce or restrict the identity of a Noahide. Similarly, prohibition of Baal Tosef does not exist to reduce or restrict the identity of a Jew. Instead, Chiddushei Dat exists to define the boundaries of Noahidism. It is clearly there to delineate where Judaism ends and Noahidism begins. Noahides may drink from the same well as Jews and to share their core beliefs and values, yet it is a religious identity wholly separate and distinct from Jews. Noahides have their own special mitzvah and missions in the world, as Jews have theirs. Noahidism is not a Judaism for non-Jews. Neither is being Noahide a way for non-Jews to participate in Judaism. For a non-Jew who wishes to observe the Jewish rules or festivals, Maimonides teaches that conversion to Judaism is the only option. Now, with that being said, let me explain. Sometimes explaining your position or who you are or your identity to a non-Jew, non-religious person, or maybe a Christian or something else, sometimes you have to add the fact that your practice is Judaism. And I don't know how you get around that, bottom line. But clearly, we're not here to practice Judaism. We're here to practice the Torah as given to Moshe through the Jews. Are we drinking from the same well? Yes, we are. But we are most definitely walking by a different distinction. Let me add this too. I've said this on many different occasions in other lectures. Distinction is our holiness. Where the Kohen Gadol has his distinction from the other Levites, and the Levites have their distinction from the Israelites, and the Israelites have their distinction as being priests to the nations have their distinction. So when Hashem says, be holy as I am holy, we have to be distinct. We must be who we are. Hashem is who he is. You can't add to or take away from him. Hashem is who he is. Divine essence of holiness and purity. How are we to be holy as non-Jews? Be yourself. Follow after the Torah. Follow after the Sheva Mitzvot. Study Torah. Live with the highest level of integrity, and you'll be doing the right thing. Now, here's the text, repeated. If a Gentile delves into the Torah or Shabbat or innovates a religious practice, he is beaten and punished, and informed him that he is obligated to die for his action. We've heard this ad nauseum. However, he is not actually executed. This is talking about a case when a non-Jew lives under Jewish sovereignty. Let me explain this. This text is clearly talking about when a non-Jew lives in the state of Israel under Jewish religious sovereignty with a Sanhedrin and a temple. He is then liable to punishment for observing these mitzvahs. Especially, he is liable to death at the hands of heaven. Notice the words hands of heaven, meaning they don't take him out and stone him. It's left up to Hashem to make that decision. Now, paragraph 10 reads as such as this. We've read this again. Should a non-Jew wish to perform one of the Torah's other mitzvahs, the prohibition of performing other Torah mitzvahs is nowhere as severe as Shabbat festivals or Torah study. In fact, a non-Jew may choose to perform other Torah commandments subject to specific conditions. These conditions are considered boundaries of Chiddushei Dat. Should a non-Jew wish to perform one of the Torah's other mitzvahs, this indicates that a non-Jew may only occasionally perform other Torah mitzvahs. If a non-Jew decides to regularly observe one of these mitzvahs, he has effectively added to a religious observance and transgresses Chiddushei Dat. Remember the word, in order to receive merit or benefit. The Radbaz writes this. If he wants to perform mitzvah saying that he has an obligation in the matter, we don't allow him to do so. However, he may perform it in order to receive reward as one who performs a mitzvah voluntarily. This is why Maimonides is careful to write the phrase that we just said, in order to receive merit or benefit. Rav Moshe explains that any spiritual motivation makes the mitzvah a religious act. This is even if the mitzvah is performed only occasionally. Therefore, the only permissible motivation can be the ulterior. However, what ulterior, non-spiritual motive could there be possibly for keeping kosher or any other mitzvahs? Maimonides is telling us that although the non-Jew may not perform the mitzvah from a sense of spiritual connection or need, he may for obligation of receiving reward. This sets the threshold of permitting motivation in performing one of the Torah's mitzvahs. However, Rav Moshe explains this is only pertaining to the motivation. The non-Jew does not actually receive reward for doing a mitzvah. This is because the Talmud explicitly learns that non-Jews does not receive reward if he performs a mitzvah as such, meaning out of obligation rather than out of reward. Nevertheless, mitzvahs that provide a logical or tangible real-world benefit may certainly be adopted. We will elaborate on this idea in a moment. Let's examine these points. We should not prevent him from doing so, even according to all the details. Unlike Shabbat festivals and certain types of Torah study, we must not stop a non-Jew from trying to do mitzvahs. However, this implies that we should neither encourage nor insist a non-Jew in doing so. The Jews do not go and knock on doors and ask people if they have accepted Moshe in their heart. We just don't do that. So the idea is that out of voluntary, they be involuntary in their search for Hashem, it's permissible. If he brings an animal to be sacrificed as a burnt offering, we should accept it. Rav Nisgaon writes these words: not all the 7 laws and their derivation require revelation. For example, the obligation to recognize God, to obey him, and the obligation to serve him, all of which are rational and can be logically derived. Certain aspects of Noahide worship and practice are permitted or proper not because they are commanded in the Torah, but because they're compelled by logic, basic common sense, and common religious needs. Therefore, Rav Moshe points out that certain mitzvahs and religious acts are certainly permitted, and they may even be done according to all the Torah details. Such mitzvahs should include prayer and certain types of offerings and tithes. To summarize, Rav Moshe says this: Noahides may not keep Shabbat and study those parts of Torah prohibited to them. The details of these prohibitions we'll discuss shortly, and we'll explain in detail. Noahide should not be encouraged to perform any other mitzvahs in the Torah. If a Noahide insists on performing mitzvahs to which he is not commanded, it is permitted, provided that his motivation is not at all spiritual. In such a case, he may perform the mitzvah according to the details, i.e., kosher, prayer 3 times a day. There are mitzvahs that you can do, but you're not, when it says in this Jewish text to not do it for the purpose that not at all spiritual, what it's meaning is out of obligation from Hashem. It still receive merit in the sense that you are approaching Hashem and attempting to connect to Hashem. This can be talked about later. Even so, a Noahide should not perform such a mitzvah regularly, because then, regardless of his motivation, it continues the establishment of a new religious practice. It's difficult to wrap your brain around, I understand. But let's give it time. Let's let this mature as we discuss it. You'll understand it better as we go along. The mitzvah, however, has no spiritual merit or meaning. Now let's talk about that. Any feeling of connection or spiritual elevation one may sense is illusionary. Now let's just briefly talk about that. The idea of feeling a connection or spiritual elevation, from a Jewish perspective, spiritual elevation and connection comes from fulfilling the mitzvah that God has commanded. When one fulfills the mitzvah that God has commanded, you are spiritually elevated whether you feel it or not. It's not about an emotion or a feeling. Many Christians that come to Torah and other spiritualists that come to Torah drag with them this sense of needing emotional stimulation and connection. This is not a Jewish idea. Even though we are emotional people and Jews are emotional people, our connection to Hashem and the Jewish connection to Hashem is not about our feelings, but what we are doing. For example, if you truly want a spiritual connection as a B'nai Noach or Ben Noach, Bat Noach, then follow the Sheva Mitzvot and study the Torah and give tithes, give charity. You'll be doing the highest level of spiritual connection. Once again, to think that you're doing mitzvahs you're not commanded and you feel that you are elevated spiritually, it's an illusion, because how can you elevate spiritually to something you were not commanded to do so? Hopefully I can bring better explanation down the road. Another point, nevertheless, there are certain spiritual practices such as prayer that are permitted to Noahides for which they are rewarded. Rav Moshe Winter in the Sefer Sheva Mitzvot, Hashem, the divine code, after reviewing the many interpretations of Maimonides, Rabbi Weiner decides the halakha, law in accordance with Rav Moshe. However, Rabbi Weiner elucidates Rav Moshe's position further. He explains that there are many mitzvahs whose performance need not to be motivated by spiritually or reward, but have an immediate real-world benefit, like eating kosher, like eating food that is clean. It is possible that a person, perhaps laudable, and in some instances even obligatory, for Noahides to perform these mitzvahs. What do I mean? Is mitzvahs that are practical and benefit is for you in this world. For example, ideas of showing charity and loving kindness to other people is very important, and it goes a long ways. It's practical. Maimonides writes, should a non-Jew wish to perform one of the Torah's other mitzvahs in order to receive merit or benefit, we should not prevent him from doing so, even according to all of its details. Now, Rav Weiner explains that the word shechar may be understood as merit or benefit. Rav Weiner explains that Maimonides' use implies benefit. Therefore, if a Noahide wishes to adopt a mitzvah that provides direct, real-world material or social benefit, it is permitted and perhaps even praiseworthy to do so. A Noahide may practice such a mitzvah regularly in accordance to all the Torah details. Hear that? Mitzvahs having real-world material or social benefit would include all those that are between man and man. And here's some examples. I started to mention one or two, and I realized I'm going to mention them later on. Honoring one's parent, giving of charity, observing prohibitions against tazar or animal cruelty, observing laws prohibiting negative speech, evil speech. There are many other examples that we'll discuss in this course. There are a number of religious observances that are between man and God, and that may also be observed, as we'll discuss later on. Now, Rabbi Weiner and Rabbi Feinstein's conclusions on Chiddushei Dat outline the guiding principles, determining whether or not a Jewish mitzvah may be practiced by a Noahide. I realize that if this is the first time that you've attended some type of extended lecture or detailed lecture on Torah law, it might be a little mind-boggling. And sometimes it appears that you have juxtaposed opinions in the same text and things that seem to be out of kilter with what other people are saying. This is the nature of legal talk, even in the world that we live in civil law. I'll give you some examples of what we're talking about as a practical example. When it says that a Noahide who takes upon himself mitzvahs that were not obligated to him by Hashem, it's considered foolish. Why would you do it? It doesn't give you any benefit. Why would you do it? Now, if you were to say, I like doing it, it's a good practice of discipline for me, there's nothing prohibiting you from doing it. However, you've got to be careful not to intimate that it is an obligation from Hashem to you for you to do, because it would mean that we are developing a new religion. Here's some examples. I live in the great state of Texas in the United States of America. And in the state of Texas, there are probably more laws that govern me driving from here to downtown Houston about 45 minutes than there are Torah laws. There are so many laws in the state, just like any other state, just like any other country in the world. There are laws that govern people according to their category and to their job and to their position and to their distinction. So therefore, pharmacists in the state of Texas have laws that they have to abide by that I'm not obligated to abide by. Now, what if I decided to read those laws and say, I think I'm going to follow some of these laws that the pharmacist does, because it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like, I have a little bit of extra discipline and understanding in my life about medicine. Well, most people would call you foolish for doing that. It just doesn't make sense. However, there's nothing prohibiting you to do that. However, if you do those things, acting as if you're obligated, you are then in danger of violating the law, impersonating a pharmacist. You get what I'm saying? So the whole point is the reason why that we We wrestle with these ideas from the sages of blessed memory. So we want to understand distinction. We want to understand our obligation, and we want to do it right. And this is not about restricting the Noahide any more than it would be restricting Jews. This is about giving you clarity on your path to righteousness. That concludes this class, and we'll see you in the next class. Shalom.